March 2021. The damp cold air clung to the storage warehouse beneath Dallas Police Headquarters, heavy with the smell of rusted metal and old paper. This was not a place meant for revelations. It was meant for forgetting. Technician Samuel Ortiz moved slowly between the aisles, his flashlight beam cutting through decades of dust. The shelves rose above him like skeletal ribs. Tens of thousands of files stacked in collapsing cardboard boxes, each one holding a story that ended badly or not ended at all. This inventory was supposed to be routine, a digitization project. Scan, catalog, move on. Then the light paused. A dark, weathered box. Label barely legible. D1-142, MP 73142. Ortiz crouched, brushing dust from the lid. The seal was still intact. He leaned toward his radio. "I need to log this file," he whispered. "The seal hasn't been broken." His voice echoed back at him in the silence. When the box was opened, nothing inside looked extraordinary. No weapons, no blood-stained clothing. Just 3 items placed carefully in evidence bags nearly half a century earlier. A piece of light-colored fabric. Frayed along one edge, a single silver earring and a handful of faded black and white photographs, their corners curled, faces barely visible anymore. These were the last things collected in the summer of 1973. For 48 years, they had been dismissed, logged, filed, forgotten. But as Ortiz lifted the fabric into the light, something else surfaced, an uncomfortable truth that Dallas had buried deep. This case hadn't gone cold because there was nothing left to find. It had gone cold because no one knew how to listen to what the evidence was trying to say. And now, in the silent warehouse, something had been awakened. The girl's name was Olivia. In 1973, Dallas was a city expanding faster than it could protect its edges. Suburbs pushed outward. Warehouses multiplied along the highways, and neighborhoods that felt safe by day grew quiet and exposed after dark. Olivia lived in one of those in-between places, not dangerous, not wealthy, just ordinary, the kind of ordinary that convinces you nothing bad will ever happen. She was young, careful, known for routines that never changed. Every morning, she left the house at the same time. Every afternoon, she walked the same route. Her silver earring, identical to the one found decades later, was a gift, worn so often that friends barely noticed it anymore. The fabric? No one remembered it at the time. It was simply logged as debris, possibly clothing, possibly nothing. That summer, when Olivia failed to come home, the first assumption was delay, a missed bus, a friend's house. Maybe she had decided, suddenly, inexplicably, to go somewhere without telling anyone. Hours passed. Then the night. By the time police were notified, the city had already swallowed the day whole. Street lights flickered on. Radios played softly in kitchens. Doors were locked. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of what felt safe, Olivia's routine had broken. When she was found, the shock was quiet, not explosive. No dramatic chase. No witnesses stepping forward. Just a scene that raised questions investigators weren't prepared to answer. The physical evidence was minimal, the timeline unclear, and the pressure to solve it limited. 1973 was not a time for forensic miracles. DNA didn't exist as a tool. Fibers were compared by eye. Photos were studied with magnifying glasses. And when nothing obvious emerged, investigators did what they often did then. They moved on. The file was sealed. The evidence boxed. The name Olivia slowly faded from conversation into memory. For her family, the years that followed were marked by absence. Holidays with an empty chair. Birthdays that passed unacknowledged. Each year without answers pressed the same question deeper into the ground. How does a life disappear in a city this large without anyone being held accountable? And for Dallas, the case became one of many. Another number. Another file. Until March 2021. Until a flashlight beam paused on a box that shouldn't have mattered anymore. Inside those evidence bags, science was waiting. Not loudly, not urgently, just patiently. The fabric held more than fibers. The earring had traveled farther than anyone realized. And the photographs, once too grainy to speak, were finally ready to be heard. What investigators failed to recognize in 1973 was simple and devastating. The truth was never gone. It was only ahead of its time. And soon, that truth would lead to an arrest that would shock the community, not because the crime was brutal, but because of who had been standing nearby all along. The box had been asleep for nearly 50 years. Now it was awake. The morning Olivia disappeared began like dozens before it, unremarkable enough to feel safe. In the early summer of 1973, Dallas was already warm before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and gasoline, and radios murmured news headlines that blended into the background of daily life. Nothing in that morning suggested it would be remembered decades later, dissected frame by people who had not yet been born. Olivia woke just after 6. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. She dressed carefully, choosing familiar clothes, the kind she wore when she didn't want to think too much about what came next. The silver earring caught the light as she fastened it in place. The small ritual so automatic it barely registered as a decision. It was the same earring she had worn countless times before, a detail so consistent it had become part of how people recognized her. Routine was Olivia's shield. She believed, like so many people do, that predictability equaled safety. Leave at the same time. Walk the same streets. Be visible. Be careful. It was a kind of logic reinforced by parents, teachers, and police pamphlets of the era. Trouble, they said, came from deviation. That morning, she followed the rules. She stepped outside just before 7. The neighborhood was already stirring. A man across the street washed his car. A delivery truck rattled past, its driver waving at someone unseen. A woman pulled weeds from a flower bed, dirt staining her hands. These were witnesses in the loosest sense. People close enough to later say they remembered seeing Olivia that day, even if they couldn't remember anything specific about her. She walked. Her route took her past a stretch of light industrial buildings, warehouses and small operations that blended into the landscape. During business hours, they were noisy and crowded. In the early morning, they were still, their wide doors closed, their loading bays empty. It wasn't considered a dangerous area. It was considered boring. At 7:18 a.m., a bus driver would later recall seeing a young woman matching Olivia's description waiting at a corner, standing just far enough from the curb to avoid splashes from passing cars. He couldn't be sure it was her. He hadn't known her name. But the time stuck with him because he was running late that morning, glancing repeatedly at his watch. That would become one of the last verified moments in Olivia's timeline. By mid-morning, concern had not yet turned into fear. When Olivia didn't arrive where she was expected, people assumed delay, a misconnection, a spontaneous change of plans. It wasn't unusual, especially not enough to warrant immediate alarm in 1973. Adults disappeared from schedules all the time for ordinary reasons. It wasn't until afternoon that the absence began to feel heavy. Calls were made. Friends were contacted. Each one ended the same way, with uncertainty, with a promise to call back if anything came to mind. By evening, the questions shifted from where is she to why hasn't anyone heard from her? When the police were finally notified, the response was restrained. Officers took notes, asked about habits, routines, clothing. They wrote down the detail about the silver earring without emphasis. They asked whether Olivia had ever run away, ever talked about leaving, ever seemed unhappy. These were standard questions, shaped by an era that often searched for explanations that placed responsibility anywhere but on the unknown. The first search was brief. A few officers walked the route Olivia was known to take. They checked obvious places. They spoke to a handful of people who lived nearby. No signs of a struggle. No abandoned belongings. No witnesses who remembered anything unusual. It was, in the language of the report, unremarkable. 2 days later, that would change. The location where Olivia was found was close enough to be unsettling. Not remote, not hidden. A short distance from where people worked, drove, and passed every day. The discovery didn't come from an active search, but from chance. Someone noticing something out of place and deciding, reluctantly, to call it in. The scene offered more questions than answers. There was no clear weapon, no obvious indication of who had been there, or how long the body had remained unnoticed. The physical evidence collected was minimal and, at the time, frustratingly vague. A small piece of light-colored fabric found nearby. A single silver earring recovered not far from it. Photographs taken quickly, capturing angles and positions without context. Investigators worked the scene the way they knew how. They measured, they documented, they speculated quietly among themselves. But without witnesses, without clear forensic markers, the case began to drift almost immediately into uncertainty. The fabric was logged without urgency. It was described simply, its origin unknown. The earring was assumed to belong to Olivia, but it didn't lead anywhere. Jewelry like it was common, easily purchased, easily overlooked. And then there was the timeline. No one could say exactly when Olivia had been killed. The window was wide, hours that blurred together, offering little direction. Without precision, suspicion had nowhere to settle. Within weeks, the investigation slowed. Leads dried up, tips came in, and went nowhere. Each unanswered question created space for another, until the case felt less like a puzzle and more like a weight. Something that could be carried but not resolved. For Olivia's family, the early days after her death were filled with interviews and quiet hope. They believed someone would remember something, that a detail, however small, would surface and change everything. But as days turned into months, the attention faded. The case was still open, technically, but it was already becoming cold. What no one realized in 1973 was that the investigation hadn't failed because the evidence was weak. It had failed because the tools of the time were incapable of hearing what that evidence was holding. The fabric, the earring, even the photographs. They were speaking in a language science hadn't learned yet. And while the city moved on, while files were stacked and shelves filled, the truth waited quietly, attached to objects no one thought to question. In the years that followed, Olivia's name would be spoken less and less outside her family. Her story would shrink into a few sentences, then a few words. Another unsolved case from another era, but the routine of that last ordinary day, the careful choices, the predictable route, the sense of safety, would become, in hindsight, the most unsettling part of all, because it proved something no one wanted to admit. Olivia did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. The years after Olivia's death stretched long and quiet, marked by absence more than noise. For Dallas, she became a faint outline in memory, a case number on a shelf. For her family, the silence was deafening. Holidays came and went, birthdays were acknowledged with empty chairs, and every anniversary deepened the ache of not knowing. Friends and neighbors tried to move on, but the uncertainty clung to those who had loved her, like a shadow refusing to be shaken. In 1974, the Dallas Police Department formally classified the case as cold. There were no active leads, no compelling evidence to pursue. Files were neatly stacked in cardboard boxes, tucked into storage rooms, out of sight and out of mind. Officers rotated through the case over the years, often encountering it only when mandated audits required a review. It was never forgotten entirely, but had become, in practical terms, dormant. A file labeled MP 73142, fading in significance as the decades passed. Yet beneath the veneer of stillness, subtle traces persisted. The fabric remained folded in its original evidence bag, frayed at the edges but intact. The silver earring, its surface dull with age, retained microscopic particles invisible to 1970s technology. The photographs, yellowed and curled, captured shadows and positions that would later guide analysts in unexpected ways. They were artifacts of time, waiting patiently for the right tools to translate them into answers. Olivia's family carried her memory forward in quiet, ritualized ways. Her mother preserved her belongings meticulously, never discarding anything that might hold a clue, while her father would sometimes pause by the places she had loved to walk. They clung to hope in ways that were both fragile and stubborn, aware that the world had moved on, but unwilling to allow their own hearts to forget. Outside the home, the city changed around her absence. New neighborhoods rose where warehouses had once been, and familiar streets became unrecognizable. Technologies advanced, forensics evolved, yet the case files remained trapped in a time when the investigative tools had been rudimentary. There were no DNA tests, no computerized databases, no widespread public awareness campaigns for missing children. What might have been solvable in later decades was, in those early years, beyond reach. Occasionally, someone would mention her name, an old neighbor, a former teacher, or a childhood friend. Each recollection was fragmented, often contradictory, highlighting the ways memory could fail or bend under the weight of time. Still, each whisper contributed to a quiet tapestry of clues, faint but persistent, that waited to be stitched together decades later. Despite the stagnation, the original investigators had unintentionally preserved the most critical aspect of the case, the evidence itself. Every fiber, every piece of metal, every photograph was archived, untouched and uncontaminated. In this careful preservation, the potential for resolution endured. Even as human attention drifted, the truth, though dormant, had survived. For nearly half a century, the story of Olivia was one of absence. Absence from life, absence from justice, absence from closure. Her community moved forward, but the memory of a girl who had been ordinary in every way remained, a subtle ache embedded in the city's history. Then came the day when a flashlight beam illuminated a dusty box labeled D1, 142, a box that had been quietly waiting for decades. The ordinary patterns of human neglect and bureaucratic routine collided with the extraordinary persistence of physical evidence. It was a moment that no one in 1973 could have anticipated, but one that would alter the trajectory of the case forever. In that quiet warehouse, the dormant fragments of Olivia's life, the fabric, the earring, the photographs, were suddenly capable of speaking. They would not shout, they would not exaggerate, but they contained enough to expose what human memory had long since obscured. The years of silence, once thought to have buried the truth, instead became the stage for its dramatic return. March 2021. The warehouse air was thick with decades of neglect. Dust motes floated like frozen motes in the flashlight beam, catching on the edges of metal shelving that had begun to rust under the weight of years. Samuel Ortiz had been tasked with a routine inventory, a digitization effort intended to preserve old files before they were lost time. He was methodical, cataloging box after box, checking seals, noting labels. Nothing unusual had happened for hours until he reached D1, 142, MP 73142. The box seemed ordinary, almost unremarkable, until Ortiz brushed away the thick layer of dust and noticed the seal was still intact. His heart didn't race. He was trained to remain professional, to note the anomaly and proceed. But even he couldn't ignore the subtle weight of history in his hands. A file untouched for nearly 50 years, carrying the remnants of crime that had confounded generations. Inside, the evidence was minimal but precise. A light-colored scrap of fabric, frayed at the edges, a silver earring, dulled by time but intact, and a few black and white photographs, their faces blurred but their angles telling a story the human eye might not fully grasp. Individually, each item had seemed inconsequential. Together, they were a map waiting to be read. Ortiz carefully logged the items, knowing this was not just cataloging. It was a first step in reactivating a case that had been considered cold for nearly 5 decades. The fabric was scanned. Microscopic fibers were noted for later analysis. The earring was photographed, measured, and its composition recorded. The photographs were digitized, their faint contrast enhanced just enough to reveal subtle details previously overlooked. Shadows, positions, objects in the background that suggested more than had ever been recorded. In 1973, these items had offered little guidance. Investigators had limited tools: fiber comparison by eye, rudimentary photography, and notes taken in the field. But now, in 2021, these same objects could speak with unprecedented clarity. DNA could be extracted from the fabric, metallic traces could be tested on the earring, and the photographs could be digitally analyzed in ways that could pinpoint locations, timelines, and even relationships. As Ortiz worked, he could feel the magnitude of what he was handling. This wasn't just paper and metal. It was history, preserved in silence, waiting for the right observer. Somewhere in the fibers and metals was a message that had gone unread for generations. It was in these moments, examining the fabric under magnification, that the first revelations began to take shape. Tiny biological traces, long ignored or invisible, were now detectable. Microscopic particles embedded in the fabric hinted at interactions that had never been accounted for. Touches, movements, proximity, all the quiet acts of crime that had been meticulously performed and then concealed. The earring, too, told a story. Its scratches, subtle and easy to dismiss, suggested struggle, transfer, and handling patterns inconsistent with simple misplacement. The photographs, once considered grainy and uninformative, began to reveal context as software and forensic algorithms enhanced their clarity. Shadows indicated objects out of place. The positioning of the figure in one image, barely visible, corresponded to the location where the fabric had been found. Angles and reflections suggested time of day. Small, seemingly trivial details, such as the orientation of a door or the glint of metal in the background, suddenly became critical pieces of the puzzle. By the end of that day, the box that had been dormant for decades had awakened. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. But it had spoken, and for the first time in nearly 50 years, it had a voice capable of reaching investigators. The awakening of this evidence would mark a turning point. For the first time, science could operate where human intuition had failed. The tools of 1973 were incapable of translating these silent fragments. The tools of 2021 were precise enough to start interpreting them. And slowly, painstakingly, the story of Olivia's last hours began to unfold. Not through confessions, not through eyewitnesses, but through the careful reading of materials that had existed all along, waiting for their moment. What began as a routine inventory had transformed into a revelation. A decades-old mystery, frozen in time, had begun to move, and as the first analytical reports returned to the Dallas Police Department, a chilling realization emerged. Someone who had once walked freely among the community was about to be exposed. Someone who had betrayed trust and familiarity. The box had been asleep for nearly half a century. Now it was wide awake. Once the evidence had been cataloged and scanned, the next phase began: analysis. In 2021, forensic science had evolved far beyond the capabilities of 1973. DNA, once unimaginable, could now speak across decades. Fibers, metals, and photographs could be examined in ways that revealed movement, contact, and connection previously hidden. The fragments from Olivia's case, long dormant, long dismissed, suddenly carried meaning. The light-colored fabric became the first point of focus. Small particles clung to its fibers, microscopic, invisible to the investigators of the 1970s. Modern laboratory techniques allowed analysts to extract DNA traces from these particles. Even after nearly 50 years, cells from skin, sweat, and hair could be isolated, sequenced, and compared against public and law enforcement databases. It was meticulous work, requiring patience and precision. Each step brought the team closer to what had been elusive for generations: a link to a human hand, a human presence at the scene. Meanwhile, the silver earring was examined for trace evidence. Small scratches, the wear patterns on its surface, and microscopic debris embedded in the clasp suggested a struggle. Forensic metallurgists could detect residues that indicated contact with substances the original investigation had never considered, elements common in certain workplaces, environments, or even vehicles. Every detail told a story, though the story remained incomplete. The photographs, once nearly indecipherable, were digitally enhanced. Shadows and reflections revealed subtle hints of surroundings: the corner of a warehouse, the angle of a fence, a glint on a piece of metal that aligned with other evidence in the box. Algorithms mapped these details against city layouts and historical maps, providing an approximate timeline and location that had been lost in the decades prior. But it was a combination of these pieces, the fabric, the earring, the photographs, that began to form a narrative. Alone, each item spoke in fragments. Together, they began to tell a coherent story. Olivia's last known movements, the moments when she had been intercepted, the evidence of contact with someone she trusted or at least recognized. The first significant breakthrough came with DNA. A partial profile emerged, one that did not match anyone in the immediate database of missing persons' relatives, but did yield distant familial connections. Through genetic genealogy, a method unavailable in 1973, investigators could identify relatives and construct family trees, tracing the DNA back to potential suspects. The initial search produced several possibilities, but one name began to surface repeatedly. A man once known in the community as trustworthy, a familiar figure who had moved among neighbors without suspicion. It was a stark realization. The betrayal that had been suspected in whispers but never proven in 1973 was now staring investigators directly in the face. The evidence suggested that the perpetrator was not a stranger, not a transient, not someone fleeing the city. He had been present in Olivia's life, nearby, trusted, or at least unchallenged, for decades. While laboratory results were still coming in, investigators revisited the original files. Notes from a 1973 investigation revealed patterns that had gone unnoticed. Small inconsistencies in witness statements, subtle references to people who were unusually close to Olivia or her family, details that now, with modern understanding, carried more weight. It was as if the past had been leaving breadcrumbs all along, but the investigators of the time had lacked a lens to interpret them. The sense of momentum was cautious, but undeniable. For the first time since Olivia's disappearance, the case was no longer defined by absence. It was defined by leads, by connections, by evidence that could finally be interpreted. Each fiber, each scratch, each shadow in the photograph became a thread pulling the investigation forward. And amid this painstaking reconstruction, a deeper tension emerged. If the evidence continued to point to someone familiar, someone once respected, what would it mean for the community? For the family? For decades of trust carefully maintained by a man who had lived unchallenged, the city that had long forgotten Olivia's name was about to confront the most uncomfortable truth. The danger had never been outside, waiting in the shadows. It had been inside, walking among them, smiling, unnoticed. By late spring of 2021, as the DNA and forensic reports began to converge, a chilling pattern emerged. The profile pointed to a man who had been a constant in the community, someone who had interacted with families, taught children, and maintained the appearance of normalcy. He was ordinary in every outward sense. The kind of neighbor people nodded to on sidewalks, the kind of man who attended community events without raising suspicion. Yet the evidence was increasingly insistent. He had been present on the day Olivia disappeared, close enough to leave physical traces, and someone the girl likely knew. This revelation reframed the investigation. For nearly 50 years, the case had been treated as the work of an unknown, transient criminal. Now, investigators realized that familiarity had been the camouflage. The ordinary had masked the extraordinary horror, and that was why the case had gone cold. No one had imagined that evil could wear the guise of trust. The detectives tasked with reopening the case approached with extreme caution. They knew that pursuing someone who had maintained a spotless public record for decades required precision. There was no room for assumptions, no tolerance for mistakes. One wrong move, one misstep in evidence handling or public statement, could jeopardize everything, including the fragile emotional state of Olivia's surviving family. Investigators began cross-referencing the old case files with modern records, employment histories, neighborhood connections, and personal acquaintances. Every minor detail from 1973 suddenly had renewed relevance. Notes about interactions with neighbors, recollections of casual conversations, and even seemingly trivial observations about habits and routines were scrutinized. Each tiny clue was analyzed under the lens of modern understanding, revealing patterns previously invisible. Simultaneously, forensic experts returned to the physical evidence. The fabric underwent further testing to identify any additional biological material. The earring, long thought to be a mere accessory, was examined under high magnification imaging, revealing residues consistent with prolonged handling and subtle transfer from human skin. These findings reinforced the growing suspicion. The perpetrator had been intimately close to Olivia, close enough for microscopic traces to survive half a century. The photographs, enhanced through digital processing, yielded further revelations. Shadows suggested presence, movement, and orientation within spaces long gone. Certain objects in the background matched locations tied to the suspect, corroborating his connection to Olivia in ways no witness had reported. For decades, the photographs had seemed static, mundane, a simple record of a moment in time. But now, they became a window into the final day of a girl whose life had been abruptly interrupted. As the case gained momentum, The investigation team confronted an unavoidable moral and social reality. The man they were now pursuing was someone whom the community had respected, whose ordinary appearance had allowed him to blend seamlessly into daily life. The betrayal inherent in that realization weighed heavily on the detectives. They understood that public reaction would be intense, that shock would ripple far beyond the immediate circle of Olivia's family. Still, the evidence was undeniable. Each test, each analytical result, confirmed what the original investigators could never have grasped. Science had illuminated what human memory, intuition, and conjecture had failed to see. That evil can thrive in plain sight, that the familiar can conceal the unimaginable, and that truth, though patient, eventually finds a way to surface. The ordinary man, the one whose life had appeared unremarkable, predictable, and safe, was, in fact, central to a crime that had haunted a family and a city for nearly 5 decades. And as investigators prepared to confront him, they also prepared to confront the reality that the most shocking betrayal was not that a crime had occurred, but that it had been committed by someone who had once been trusted. Every step forward was deliberate, every move calculated. The detectives knew that uncovering the truth was not just about arresting a man. It was about restoring justice, giving a family closure, and proving that time, no matter how long, does not guarantee impunity. By the summer of 2021, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. The DNA extracted from the fabric, once considered a faint trace of no consequence, had finally yielded a profile sufficient for comparison. Genetic genealogy, a field that had matured only in the past decade, allowed detectives to trace familial connections across public databases. What had once been an isolated scrap of evidence was now a beacon pointing to a living person, someone long overlooked because of their ordinariness. The process was painstaking. Analysts mapped distant relatives, piecing together family trees that stretched across decades. Each link had to be verified and cross-checked, ensuring that assumptions did not contaminate the evidence. Investigators revisited records from 1973, overlaying new findings against old files. Notes, witness statements, and even small discrepancies that had been dismissed in the original investigation suddenly took on meaning. It was in this careful reconstruction that the breakthrough crystallized. The DNA matched not only a distant relative, but also a person who, when cross-referenced with other evidence, fit a pattern invisible in the 1970s. The same man had been in proximity to Olivia during the last hours she was seen alive. The fabric and earring, once inert items, now provided microscopic confirmation of contact. Shadows and photographs aligned with his known movements and residences at the time. Every thread of evidence converged, pointing toward one shocking reality. The person responsible had lived among the community unchallenged for nearly 50 years. Detectives knew the implications. This was no longer a cold case in the traditional sense. It was a living, breathing pursuit. But with decades of absence came complications. The suspect's life had evolved. Careers built, relationships formed, a reputation carefully maintained. Public exposure required meticulous strategy, balancing the need for arrest with the preservation of the integrity of the investigation. Law enforcement worked quietly, assembling corroborating evidence. The silver earring, previously dismissed, was re-examined to identify residues and handling patterns. Forensic analysts confirmed that microscopic traces on the earring corresponded precisely to the suspect's DNA. The light-colored fabric, too, was tested repeatedly, each analysis reinforcing the same conclusion. These findings were no longer suggestive. They were conclusive. Meanwhile, detectives prepared to revisit witnesses and family members, seeking details that had been overlooked in 1973. Every recollection, however faint, became critical. Neighbors remembered small, peculiar behaviors. A former colleague recalled the suspect discussing topics that in hindsight appeared suspiciously precise. These fragments, combined with modern forensic science, created a chain of evidence both scientifically robust and narratively undeniable. The realization weighed heavily on the investigative team. This case was more than a resolution of crime. It was a reckoning. The community would be shocked, not by the violence itself, would have been horrific, certainly, but by the revelation that someone once considered ordinary, trusted, and familiar had committed such an unimaginable act. The betrayal ran deeper than any physical evidence. striking at the very foundation of social trust. In private, family members were contacted with careful preparation. The investigators conveyed the truth with precision, acknowledging the decades of silence and the pain of uncertainty. For them, the breakthrough was not just scientific. It was deeply personal. The evidence, long dormant, had finally given voice to a story that had been silenced for nearly 50 years. As arrest plans were finalized, the detectives reflected on the extraordinary persistence of truth. The items in that dusty box, fabric, earring, photographs, had waited patiently, untouched and undervalued, until the right technology and expertise could interpret them. What had once been invisible had now become undeniable, a testament to the idea that justice, though delayed, is never truly defeated. And so, after decades of waiting, the case was poised to enter its most dramatic phase, confronting the suspect, delivering accountability, and finally bringing closure to a story that had haunted Dallas for generations. It was a quiet morning in late 2021 when Dallas police executed the arrest that would finally break the silence surrounding Olivia's disappearance. The man, now in his 70s, had long lived a life of unassuming normalcy. He had been a neighbor, a colleague, someone whom others in the community described as trustworthy. The irony was striking. For decades, the very ordinariness that had allowed him to blend into background had shielded him from suspicion. Detectives approached with caution. They knew that decades had passed, and that any misstep could compromise the case. Every move was meticulously planned. Surveillance confirmed his routines, officers coordinated entry points, and forensic teams were on standby to secure any residual evidence from his home. The arrest, while calm in execution, carried the weight of decades of unresolved pain, hope, and unanswered questions. When the suspect was taken into custody, the shock rippled through the community. News outlets were inundated with calls. Neighbors whispered in disbelief, and social media erupted with mix of horror and disbelief. How could someone so familiar, so seemingly ordinary, commit such a crime and evade detection for nearly 50 years? The answer, investigators knew, lay in the patient silence of the evidence itself and the limitations of the 1970s investigative methods. In the interrogation room, the suspect initially maintained composure, a practice calm that belied the mounting pressure. Detectives presented the forensic evidence, DNA from the fabric, residues on the earring, and corroborating details from the photographs. They explained the genealogy work that traces connections to Olivia's final moments. Each piece of evidence was methodically laid out, leaving no room for denial or misinterpretation. Slowly, the gravity of decades of evasion began to weigh on him. The man who had once navigated the community unnoticed now faced incontrovertible proof of his actions. It was a confrontation not just with law enforcement, but with time itself. The idea that a crime, no matter how carefully concealed, cannot remain hidden forever. For Olivia's family, the arrest was both devastating and cathartic. The years of uncertainty, grief, and unanswered questions culminated in this moment, delivering a mix of emotions: sorrow for what had been lost, anger at the betrayal of trust, and relief that accountability was finally within reach. Every detail, every fragment of evidence, had led to the singular point where justice could begin to take shape. The broader community, too, grappled with a profound sense of betrayal. The realization that evil had existed among them, unseen and unchallenged, shook the foundations of everyday trust. Yet, amid the shock, there was also a sense of closure. The decades-long mystery had finally yielded a tangible outcome. The truth, patient and persistent, had endured. The arrest marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Legal proceedings, reflection, and, for those closest to Olivia, a long-awaited step toward healing. It was proof that even after nearly half a century, justice can prevail, not through luck, not through chance, but through the unyielding persistence of evidence and human determination. In the days following the arrest, the details of the case began to emerge with unprecedented clarity. For nearly 50 years, Olivia's disappearance had been shrouded in mystery. Now, thanks to modern forensic science and painstaking investigation, the story could finally be reconstructed. Each fragment of evidence, the fabric, the silver earring, the black and white photographs, became a narrative thread connecting her final moments to the person responsible. Investigators revealed that the suspect, the seemingly ordinary man who had walked freely among the community for decades, had exploited familiarity as a shield. He had known Olivia, understood her routines, and used that knowledge to avoid detection. What appeared ordinary to the outside world had concealed an extraordinary betrayal. Forensic analysis confirmed that fibers from his clothing were present on a scrap of fabric, and microscopic residues on the earring matched his DNA. The photographs, once grainy and indecipherable, had captured subtle details, the positioning of objects, shadows, that corroborated his presence near the scene of the crime. The narrative reconstructed from these pieces was both chilling and precise. Olivia, careful and routine-bound, had unknowingly walked into danger that had lurked close to her everyday life. The timeline of her last day became more vivid. The morning departure, the walk through familiar streets, the subtle moments captured in shadows and reflections. Evidence indicated the point at which she had been intercepted, the physical interactions that left traces behind, and the path that led to her final hours. For the first time, investigators could articulate how the crime had unfolded without relying on speculation. The suspect's actions were methodical, calculated, and, in a sense, cunning in their ordinariness. He had depended on the trust of those around him, the assumption that familiar faces were safe, to commit an act that will remain hidden for decades. In press briefings and statements, the police emphasized the remarkable nature of the breakthrough. The crime had remained unsolved not because of negligence, but because the tools of 1973 could not capture the subtle physical traces that modern science now revealed. The success of the investigation highlighted the evolution of forensic capabilities, how DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, and advanced imaging techniques could bring decades-old crimes to light. For Olivia's family, hearing the reconstructed timeline was both horrifying and clarifying. They could finally understand, in concrete terms, the events that had been obscured by time. The knowledge of what happened did not erase grief, but offered closure. The uncertainty that had lingered for generations, the haunting question of why and how, was replaced by clarity. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit together, forming a narrative that, though tragic, was complete. The community, too, grappled with the revelation. Shock gave way to a mixture of relief and horror. The man who had seemed ordinary, who had blended seamlessly into daily life, was not simply a figure from history. He had been an agent of trauma, hidden in plain sight. The case became a cautionary tale about trust, vigilance, and the persistence of justice. As the legal process moved forward, the evidence collected in the warehouse, the box that had waited for nearly 50 years, remained central. Each item, once dismissed, had become a linchpin in unraveling decades of silence. The fabric, the earring, and the photographs had endured the passage of time, carrying a truth that no memory, no witness statement, and no passage of decades could erase. Olivia's story, reconstructed through science and patience, emerged as a testament to the resilience of truth. Time had not diminished it. Silence had not buried it. And now, after nearly half a century, justice had a path forward. With the suspect in custody and the evidence meticulously documented, Dallas police and prosecutors moved into the final, crucial phase, securing justice. This was not simply about filing charges. It was about bridging a gap of nearly 50 years, holding someone accountable for a crime that had haunted a family, a community, and a city. The challenge was immense. Memories had faded, witnesses had aged, and the original investigators were long retired or deceased. Yet the modern forensic breakthroughs provided the clarity needed to move forward with confidence. Court proceedings began with careful preparation. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence extracted from the fabric and earring, detailing how genetic genealogy had identified the suspect. They supplemented this with enhanced photographic analysis, showing how shadows, angles, and subtle details corroborated the timeline of Olivia's last hours. Every piece was cross-referenced with the original case files, demonstrating not only the crime itself but the suspect's movements and proximity to Olivia. In court, the narrative of betrayal struck deeply. The suspect's facade of normalcy, once unquestioned by the community, became a focal point. Witnesses described him as friendly, dependable, ordinary. And yet, the prosecution painted a starkly different picture, a man who had exploited trust, who had concealed intent, and whose ordinariness had masked extraordinary malice. The juxtaposition was chilling, underscoring the shock the community would experience upon learning the truth. For Olivia's family, the courtroom proceedings were both painful and redemptive. Each detail, each piece of evidence presented, reaffirmed that the investigation had been thorough and meticulous. For decades, they had carried unanswered questions, grief compounded by silence. Now, the truth was being acknowledged, articulated, and formally recognized. It was justice not only in legal terms, but also in moral and emotional dimensions. The legal process, though procedural, also highlighted the evolution of forensic science. Techniques unavailable in 1973, DNA sequencing, genetic genealogy, and high-resolution photographic analysis were pivotal. The case became a benchmark for how cold cases could be resolved decades after the fact, demonstrating that time, while it can obscure, cannot eliminate accountability when evidence is preserved and technology advances. During sentencing, the court recognized a profound breach of trust inherent in the crime. The man who had once seemed ordinary was condemned not just for the act itself, but for the deception and manipulation that allowed it to remain hidden for so long. The verdict sent a clear message. Ordinary appearances do not shield wrongdoing, and the law, though patient, will eventually catch up with those who evade justice. In the aftermath, Olivia's family began the slow process of healing. While no legal outcome could fully erase decades of grief, the arrest and conviction provided closure. They could finally honor her memory without the lingering shadow of unanswered questions. For the broader community, the case became a moment of reckoning, a stark reminder of vigilance, the persistence of truth, and the moral imperative to protect the vulnerable. The items in the dusty warehouse, the fabric, the earring, the photographs, remained central symbols of this resolution. What had once been dismissed as insignificant now stood as testaments to the endurance of truth. These objects, preserved carefully across decades, had finally fulfilled their purpose: to speak, to guide, and to reveal a long-hidden crime. The case concluded with a sense of finality rare in cold cases. Justice, delayed but unwavering, had been served. Olivia's story, long suspended in silence, had emerged fully formed. The betrayal, the grief, the shock, all were acknowledged, and in the end, the patient persistence of evidence had triumphed over time, deception, and neglect. In the weeks following conviction, the atmosphere around Olivia's story shifted. Where there had once been uncertainty and silent grief, there was now acknowledgement, a formal recognition of truth. For her family, the journey that had begun in the ordinary rhythms of 1973, her morning routines, the silver earring she always wore, the light-colored fabric of a day never to be repeated, had reached a form of closure. The long arc of injustice, stretching across decades, had been bent toward accountability. Visiting her childhood neighborhood, her parents reflected on what had been lost. Streets that had once seemed familiar now carried the weight of memory. The parks where Olivia had walked, the corners where she waited for buses, even the warehouses that had once been just a backdrop to daily life, were imbued with a new gravity. They understood, finally, not only the events of that tragic summer, but also the way trust had been exploited. It was a sobering awareness. The ordinary can conceal danger, the familiar can harbor betrayal, and the passage of time does not guarantee safety or certainty. For the Dallas Police Department, the case became a model of persistence and adaptation. Investigators, historians, and forensic experts highlighted the importance of evidence preservation, demonstrating how seemingly minor items, the scrap of fabric, the silver earring, and the faded photographs, can hold the key to truth even after nearly 50 years. The case underscored the value of patient, methodical investigation and the integration of emerging technologies, proving that modern science can uncover the stories that earlier eras could not interpret. The arrest and conviction rippled through the community, prompting conversations about vigilance, trust, and accountability. Neighbors who had once accepted the ordinariness of those around them began to reassess the dynamics of safety and observation. It was not a message of paranoia, but of awareness. The ordinary is not always as it seems, and vigilance can coexist with trust. At the center of this reflection was Olivia herself. She was no longer a nameless case file, no longer a statistic fading into the background of Dallas history. Her memory, preserved in objects, photographs, and the diligent records of those who refused to let her story vanish, became a symbol of endurance. The tragedy of her life did not end with her disappearance. It continued in the lessons learned, in the pursuit of justice, and in the acknowledgement of moral responsibility. Ultimately, the Dallas 1973 cold case was resolved not through luck or sudden revelation, but through decades of patient preservation, the evolution of science, and the unwavering determination of those unwilling to let time erase truth. The box that had sat dormant in a warehouse, its contents overlooked, underestimated, and misunderstood, had become the bridge between unresolved grief and closure. For the family, closure was quiet and profound. It was not celebratory but reflective, a recognition that the story, though tragic, had been acknowledged, that justice had been served, and that the betrayal, however painful, would not define Olivia's memory. The past, once obscured, had finally been illuminated, offering both accountability and a chance to grieve fully. And for the city, the case served as a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a remarkable resilience. It waits patiently, quietly, in forgotten evidence, in the meticulous care of those who remember, in the fibers and traces of ordinary days that hold extraordinary secrets. Eventually, it surfaces. Eventually, it speaks. Eventually, justice is done. Olivia's story, once silent for nearly 50 years, now resonates as a testament to patience, science, and the enduring power of truth. The ordinary, once a mask for betrayal, ultimately yielded to the extraordinary persistence of evidence, and the community, shaken but wiser, learned that closure is possible, even after decades, even after silence, even after grief. The case was over. The truth had endured, and for Olivia, at last, it was finally heard.